It was 7:44 in the morning on a Tuesday in late May. A cluster of elementary school students was gathered at a bus stop in a quiet residential neighborhood in Kawasaki. Backpacks on, dressed in Navy school uniforms, waiting for the bus that would take them to Caritas Elementary School, a private Catholic school nearby. Parents stood with them. The morning air was still. A man was walking toward them. He was 51 years old, a local resident who had barely left his house in years. He lived just a short distance away with his elderly uncle and aunt. He had not held a job in a very long time. In each hand, he was carrying a long-bladed knife. In the final few seconds, before everything changed, he didn't shout and he didn't run. He walked up quietly, like someone heading somewhere ordinary, and then he raised the knives. In under a minute, 20 people were attacked. 2 of them didn't survive. This is the story of the 2019 Kawasaki stabbing. On the morning of May 28, 2019, students from Caritas Elementary School were gathered at their regular assembly point near Noborito Station in Kawasaki's Tama ward, waiting for the school bus to arrive. Caritas is a well-regarded private Catholic school, the kind of institution where families invest carefully in their children's futures. Parents were with the children, some were saying goodbye. It was, by every visible measure, a completely ordinary morning. Ryuichi Iwasaki approached from behind, without making a sound. Then, without any warning, he shouted something to the effect of, "I'm going to kill you," and he began to slash. He held a knife in each hand, both yanagiba, the long, narrow blades traditionally used in Japanese cooking for slicing fish, and he moved through the group at speed, cutting whoever was near him. The attack lasted less than 1 minute. When it was over, 20 people had been stabbed or slashed. 2 of them died. Hanako Kuribayashi was 11 years old. She was a 6th-grade student at Caritas. She died from her wounds. Satoshi Oyama was 39. He was a foreign ministry official who had come to the bus stop that morning to see his daughter off to school. He was stabbed multiple times and did not survive. 18 others were injured, the majority of them elementary school children. In the immediate chaos, bystanders rushed to help the wounded. Iwasaki, after the attack, turned one of the blades on himself and stabbed himself in the neck. He was taken to hospital but died shortly after. 3 people were dead, 2 victims, and the man who had killed them. In November 2019, Japanese prosecutors formally closed the investigation. With the perpetrator dead, no charges could be filed. The motive, officially, was never established. This was not a fully impulsive act. 4 days before the stabbing, on May 24th, Iwasaki reportedly came to the area near the bus stop. Investigators later concluded he had visited the site in advance, likely to observe the routine. The Caritas students gathered at the same location, at the same time, every school morning. The schedule was entirely predictable. The weapons are also telling. The 2 yanagiba knives, long, slender, and sharper than most kitchen blades, are not something a person grabs on impulse. Iwasaki came prepared. He also had 2 additional knives on him that, according to investigators, he never drew during the attack. He arrived with more than he needed. He picked a moment when the target group was stationary and clustered. A school bus stop, in the morning rush, with children waiting in a group. A crowd that stays in one place at a predictable time. The silent approach, the sudden shout, the immediate sustained slashing. These elements together suggest a degree of planning, even if the specific scale or exact targets may not have been fixed in advance. What sets this case apart from similar attacks is the silence that followed. There was no letter discovered, no prior social media post, no manifesto. Iwasaki said nothing before the attack and died before police could question him. Investigators had no confession, no stated motive, no trail of communications to follow. Only a crime scene, a dead perpetrator, and decades of quiet withdrawal as context. The honest answer, the one Japanese investigators ultimately accepted, is that no one knows, because Iwasaki died at the scene and left no written record of his intentions. The public understanding of why he did what he did is necessarily incomplete. What we have is a portrait of the life he led before May 28th, assembled from the outside in. Ryuichi Iwasaki was born in 1968. His parents divorced when he was young, and he was raised by his uncle and aunt in the same Tama Ward neighborhood where the attack would eventually happen. At some point in his adult life, possibly in his 20s or 30s, he stopped working, he stopped going out. He became what Japan calls a hikikomori, a social recluse, a person who had withdrawn from ordinary life so completely that years went by without meaningful contact with the outside world. By 2019, he was 51 years old, still living in his uncle and aunt's home, financially dependent on them. His uncle and aunt were both in their 80s. By all accounts, they had continued to support him, financially and by sharing their home, even as the situation became increasingly difficult. They had gone to Kawasaki City's mental health and welfare center more than a dozen times, around 14 consultations since 2017 alone, telling officials they were worried about their nephew's isolation and behavior. City officials later described the elderly couple as afraid to provoke him. Not once in all of those consultations did a social worker actually meet Iwasaki directly. He refused contact. He communicated by leaving notes outside his room. One of those notes, it said, stated that he was not dangerous and was not a burden to anyone. He insisted on his own terms right up to the end. It's also reported that a cousin who grew up in the same household had attended Caritas Elementary School as a child. Whether this connection to the school had any bearing on Iwasaki's choice of target is not confirmed. Investigators noted the link, but no definitive explanation was ever established. What we're left with is the outline of a man who spent decades being slowly erased from ordinary life, no employment, no relationships, no participation in the world around him, until something at some point turned inward-outward. Japan has a name for what was happening in that household, the 80-50 problem. The term refers to the ages, parents in their 80s still supporting children who are now in their 50s. The child, often someone who withdrew from society in their 20s or 30s and never found their way back, can no longer function independently. The parents, now elderly and frequently frightened of conflict, feel unable to force a change. The arrangement holds together through a kind of exhausted inertia, with everyone in it quietly waiting for something, they're not always sure what, to shift. Ryuichi Iwasaki fit this pattern precisely. He was fully dependent on two people who were, by their own account to city officials, afraid to upset him. The welfare system had been consulted 14 times, and yet the only form of communication that ever actually reached him was a piece of paper slid under a door, because that was the only contact he would allow. After the attack, Japanese media drew a straight line between hikikomori status and violence, and advocates for social recluses pushed back hard. The KHJ National Federation of Families with Social Recluses issued a public statement emphasizing that hikikomori, as a condition, does not cause violence, and that treating it as though it does would drive families deeper into shame and further from asking for help. They were right to say it. Japan's government estimated that around 610,000 people, aged 40 to 64, were living as hikikomori at the time. And the vast, overwhelming majority of them never harm anyone. The link between social withdrawal and violence is not direct, and flattening it into a simple equation does damage to people who are already struggling. What Iwasaki's case represents is something narrower. What can happen when someone falls entirely outside of society's ability to reach them, not for weeks or months, but for decades? The social gravity that holds most people in check, jobs, relationships, reputation, responsibilities to others, had eroded across a very long time. By the point where welfare workers were trying to reach him through notes left outside a door, whatever connection he'd once had to other people's reality had already grown very thin. This is interpretive rather than a clinical analysis. We don't know what was going through Iwasaki's mind in the days or hours before the attack. We don't know what finally moved. But what we do know is that by the morning of May 28th, whatever had kept him contained for decades no longer held. 6 days after the Kawasaki stabbing, a different story broke across Japan. Hideaki Kumazawa, 76 years old, a retired senior official from Japan's Agriculture Ministry, stabbed and killed his own 44-year-old son at their Tokyo home. His son had also been living as a recluse and had, according to Kumazawa, become violent toward family members. Kumazawa told police he had become afraid that his son might one day hurt strangers the way Ryuichi Iwasaki had hurt people in Kawasaki. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 6 years in prison in 2021. 2 cases, 1 week apart, a 51-year-old hikikomori who attacked strangers, and a 76-year-old father who killed his own son in terror of a repeat. Japan's 80-50 problem in the bleakest possible terms. For Hanako Kuribayashi's family, and for the family of Satoshi Oyama, the national debate that followed must feel impossibly abstract set against what they personally lost. Hanako was 11 years old, a 6th grader with a whole life ahead of her. Satoshi Oyama had driven to a school bus stop on a Tuesday morning to say goodbye to his daughter, and he didn't come home. Caritas Elementary School cancelled its term-end ceremony that year. The children who were there, who saw what they saw, carry that morning with them in a way that statistics and policy discussions cannot touch. What we can say, what this case demands we say, is that the system had approximately 14 documented opportunities to find a path forward, and it never reached the person it needed to reach. Not once. That is not a reason to fear or stigmatize the hundreds of thousands of people living in quiet, painful withdrawal across Japan. It is a reason to ask, urgently and seriously, what it means to truly intervene, not to file a report or log a consultation, but to actually reach the person behind the door. If you're staying with us because these cases feel like they matter, because you think it's worth understanding what breaks in ordinary life before catastrophe becomes the only outcome, then please subscribe. These are the stories that disappear from the headlines after a week. We're not going to let them.